Anytime you want to start.
Okay, let's start. I think I know everybody except maybe Terri.
Yeah.
So, hi, Terri. I'm Terri. You even spell your name the same way. That's great.
It's the right way.
I agree. Let's see. So I was in Newfoundland from May 18th to June 21st. And the first 10 days of the trip, I was with my brother, and the rest of the time I was by myself. And it involved months and months of planning. Some of your accommodations you have to book well in advance because they don't have very many hotels. So it's almost all Airbnbs. And then some like little cottages and things like that. And so to start to plan, I signed up I got a packet from the Newfoundland and Labrador tourist office that they mailed, which had a nice book and a huge driving map. And then I also joined a couple of Facebook groups that were tremendously helpful. So, and so people ask me, why did you go to Newfoundland and Labrador? And basically it's because I wanted to see ice. And that interest came about when I went to Iceland and Greenland and realized how much I loved seeing ice. So I took my brother with me the first 10 days as a birthday present for him. And my little brother is a sun goddess. And so, but water. And so we were trying to figure out where to go that we would both be happy. And I knew I wouldn't be happy anywhere that was hot and sunny, but I knew he would be happy somewhere where we could be on the water and in boats. So, so I enticed him to Newfoundland and Labrador to the area called Iceberg Alley, which is the east coast of Newfoundland. So that's how we ended up there. So I'll give you a little bit of information about icebergs, and I hope this isn't all too boring, but anyway. So each summer, the icebergs drift along the coast to the east coast of Labrador and Newfoundland, in the area is called Iceberg Alley. And all icebergs is solid water, and they float because the density of the ice is less than the density of the seawater. They can be very small, and they can also be huge in size. A 10-story building size iceberg is really not very big in the world of icebergs, just to give you some perspective. Some icebergs are over 1 million tons. They come in all shapes and sizes. We saw some that were just really long and flat, and they're known as tabular icebergs. Some look more like mountains or towers or pyramids. Some have holes, some have swirls, like you can see in this one. There's swirls. And all of that is because they've been molded and shaped by the action of the wind and the waves. And they're formed in both the Arctic and Antarctic oceans. And the Arctic icebergs mainly come from Greenland, which is almost entirely covered by an ice sheet. And it's estimated that the ice cap up in Greenland produces 10,000 to 30,000 icebergs each year, but only a few hundred reach Newfoundland and Labrador. And the transition from Greenland to large masses of ice covering Greenland began about 3 million years ago. And it's believed that there is nothing as large or thick as the Greenland ice sheet. So, oh, sorry, forgot to move my screen so you can see a couple other icebergs. So 10% of the iceberg is above the water and 90% is below the water, which is why you don't get too close to an iceberg. Because if the iceberg fractures, it can spin over and you can end up with a lot more ice above the water. And you can also end up with big waves that you may or might not want to enjoy, depending on how big of a boat you're in and whatnot. But you can see how the icebergs are different shapes from the waves and the elements, basically. I took this picture just to give some perspective, because when I was taking pictures of icebergs from the land, they look so small. But when you look at it compared to the hills in the background and the car, it gives it a lot more perspective, even though it's not the best picture. Oh, sorry, let me zoom in a little so you can see that. So the number of icebergs that come down through Iceberg Alley vary each year. Last year they had 1. The year before they had 0, and this year they have tons of them. So we couldn't have been more fortunate with seeing ice. So icebergs, the big tabular icebergs, can be up to 600 plus feet long, which compares to the size of an oil rig. A medium-sized iceberg can get to be about 330 feet long, which compares to a large ocean-going ship. And then smaller icebergs are more like the size of a basketball court. Then there are little bergy bits. There's also sea ice. So sea ice is saltwater ice, which is not iceberg ice. Iceberg ice is all freshwater, 100% freshwater. The temperature inside the iceberg is about -15, and the age of the water that makes up the iceberg is believed to be at least 12,000 years old. So you can't get any cleaner, right? It hasn't been polluted and whatnot. So, icebergs can be several hundred feet underwater, which is why they're so dangerous for ships. Because the underwater piece doesn't just go straight down and you can avoid it, but it can also be quite wide. Iceberg ice is extremely hard, and it can rip through the hole. It can rip a hole through the hull of a ship like a can opener. Iceberg ice it makes a snap, crackle, pop sound when you put water on it. So that's kind of fun. One day my brother went out to the shore and picked up some icebergs and brought them home, and we washed it off and chopped it up and had cocktails. Iceberg vodka and lemonade. That was delicious. If you use sea ice, it's not so tasty unless you like salt water. Let's see here. Okay. Okay. So just a little bit about the culture of Newfoundland and Labrador. So that it has a lot of indigenous heritage, just like the US. And then there's also the settlers and colonizers that came from England and Ireland and France. For thousands of years, indigenous groups have lived in the province. And John Cabot and the Europeans arrived in about 1497. They did a lot of fishing off the coast. First, they just came annually, and then they started to settle a little bit more. But it's interesting because different parts of Newfoundland and Labrador have different different cultures. So some where the Irish settled have more Irish culture and music. Some where the French settled are a little more French. And so that was kind of interesting. Newfoundland and Labrador were under British rule until 1949, at which time they joined Canada. And when I was talking with some of the locals in different areas of the province, they were saying that they're much better off, even though they feel like they're often forgotten by Canada because they're, all the way east and blah, blah, blah. They're still better off than they were when they were ruled under British rule. So our first stop when we landed in Newfoundland was at St. John's, which is a pretty common place for people to fly in and out of. And there they have these jelly bean row houses, and you'd think—
Terri, make the picture bigger.
Oh, sorry. And you would think that it was just some really fun background around these colorful houses, but it's not. Somebody, a man who was the executive director of a heritage foundation in the mid-70s, thought it would look nice if they painted a block different colored houses, and everybody loved it, and it caught on, and so more and more it's being done. A little bit different from Greenland. In Greenland, the color of the house designated like who lived in the house. So, if it was pick a color, if it was a green house, it was the banker. If it was a yellow house, it was the baker. If it was a red house, it was the doctor, other colors for the schools. But in Newfoundland, the colors don't mean anything other than they're really fun to look at. And they make for nice pictures. There are a lot of historical sites in the St. John's area, forts and lighthouses and whatnot. And there's also nearby on the what they call the Avalon Peninsula is this area called Petty Harbor and Maddox Cove, which I really loved. It was really charming. The fishermen were out on the docks, so you could chat with them. And they were fishing for crab and lobster mainly. Cod used to be the main fishing, commercial fishing there, but there's a lot of limits on cod fishing now, and so you don't really make a living doing cod fishing anymore. So that's port. That's Maddox Cove, and this is Cape Spear Lighthouse. It was operated as a lighthouse in 1836, and it was the second lighthouse built in Newfoundland. The first was built in 1810 at Fort Amherst, and which there's lots of lighthouses all over, which they need because the coast is treacherous, so ships need to be warned about where they are. There's also lots of boardwalks in Newfoundland and Labrador, which I really loved because it made it much easier to get from, point A to point B. And they maintain their boardwalks. You can see they maintain them quite well, which was fun. It's easier than climbing over all the wet rocks. This was an area of town that had quite a large pond, and it had a boardwalk that went all around the pond. So you could, go for your morning walk and walk around the pond on a boardwalk.
Make the picture bigger, don't forget.
Oh my goodness. I wish it just stayed bigger. And then these, sorry for the grainy picture, but these are the puffins, which a lot of people go to Newfoundland to see the puffins. And this picture is pretty grainy. They are a little ways away, although this time of year, see, we were there very early in the season. This time of year, they will actually, come and stand right next to you, so you could get really good photos. So I might have to go back again. They're very cute. Okay. This was an area called Twillingate. There's a lot of distance, and most towns are very small. Like you'll see a town on a map and there might only be 200 people in the town. And so the towns are pretty small. I think you can count, on, one hand or two at the most, the number of cities on the island that have stoplights. There's stop signs, but there's very few stoplights. So these are just little cottages, but I like all the fishing gear and stuff too. So it's very fun. There are tons of potholes. I don't have a picture of one for you, but it's full employment trying to keep the potholes filled. But the problem is you can only do that during the summer, and that's when you have tourists on the road. So it's a real predicament for the locals on how to address that. So this was our first night in Twillingate, where where we saw our icebergs for the first time, and this is just a sunset photo. I didn't talk about those colorful houses. They're called stages. So the fishing stages are all along the shore, and they've been used for centuries or decades. They're small wooden buildings. They're associated with the cod fishery that was very essential for Newfoundland. And they're located on the edge of the water, by the sea, and they consist generally of just an elevated platform, and then inside there are all these tables. So that's where they work. That's where they bring the fish in. That's where they process it. That's where they salt it, and that's where they dry it. And usually they were painted a kind of a red color, but now they're painting them in lots of colorful colors, and it's good for tourists for photo ops and whatnot. This is a picture of Captain Dave. Captain Dave was one of the iceberg boat trips that we went on, and He is such an interesting man.
Is he in the
Um,
background, Terry? Because this is a picture of you and your brother.
no, that's Dave. That's not
Okay.
my brother.
Oh, cool. Okay.
My brother's in the background.
Oh, good. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Um, and he grew up in Newfoundland on a small island just across the bay that you see behind you, or the inlet. And so his roots run really deep. He brought his father's fishing stage from the island over to where he lives now in Twillingate, just across the bridge there. And also tons of artifacts. So he has a museum that has maybe a half a dozen or more small buildings. And then he has his boat business where he takes people out. He he's a poet, he's a songwriter. He's really trying to preserve the history of Newfoundland and Labrador and the history of the people who lived there before, there was still cod fishing. Now that there's not cod fishing, there's no, you can't really live on a small little island because there's no work and there's nothing to do. And so anyway, he was very interesting. So this is just one of the bergs that we saw when we were out with him. And I love it's so interesting. We probably are a little close to this, but he had a different kind of boat. He didn't have the usual tourist boat where you're all, stacked inside of a dang, I probably shouldn't. Anyway, stacked inside of a big like Zodiac, where there's like 4 people across and, 12 rows. He just had a flat bottom boat, which flat bottom boats maneuver quite easily and quickly. So anyway, so this was another berg. And okay, then my brother and I did a sea kayak trip, and we're quite a distance away from that iceberg, like a long, long way. And but it was a blast. We had our reservation for 2:00 in the afternoon. We got a call that morning from the kayak place and said, it's going to be really windy this afternoon. We need to go out this morning or not at all. So we're like, okay, we'll come now. So it was a blast. No whales. We were there too early for the whales, but now we're seeing lots of pictures posted of icebergs and whales all in the same photo, which would be very fun. I had lobster dinner like 6 times. Because when you're there and they're fresh. This place this is a very famous lobster place, and you go in and they ask you what size lobster you want, and then they say, okay, we'll be back in a half hour, and then they go cook it and bring it back to you. So it's very fresh. So this was so we went to an area. So after we were on the East Coast here, then we moved over to the West Coast to go to Gros Morne National Park, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and a little area called Rocky Harbor. We were able to participate in a couple of different concerts. They're called Trail Tales and Tunes, and it's a festival that they have in a little town called Norris Point every year in May, which is one of the only things going on in May. Little did I know how many things would be closed yet. And a lot of places didn't open till the end of June. So even though I was there till June 21st, there were still a lot of places that weren't open yet, but that's okay. So anyway, it was a lot of fun to hear local musicians and just be a part of those community events. This was after I dropped my brother off at the airport at Deer Lake. I was on my own then until June 21st. And this is just from a hike that I did outside of Clarenville. And you can see what a beating the trees take from the weather, which isn't too unlike the Oregon coast, and the rock formations were really interesting. And that they really need a cemetery for old boats, but instead they put them out where you can get great photos. So I did have one very interesting Airbnb experience. I'll share with you. That was, I stayed at what used to be a convent. So it had, I think, 9 bedrooms upstairs and 2 bathrooms.
Mhm.
And one of the bedrooms was the owner's. And then the bathroom, only one bathroom was working because it was May and they hadn't opened their second bathroom up yet. So yeah, I shared the bathroom with, with the owners. And the owners were interesting characters. And the convent had never been updated. So it had kind of a yuck factor to it, but also it was interesting. They had one room downstairs that was like a little museum with all their family history. They too had lived on a small island, cod fishing, their parents, and then when cod fishing ended, they had to move to the mainland of Newfoundland. They also, they also had hosted 17 foreign exchange students over their years in St. George's, which I thought was really interesting. And they still keep in touch with most of them.
Oh my.
Yeah, so that was really fun to hear their stories. Okay, so now I'm heading down to southern Newfoundland, southwestern Newfoundland, and there's a town called Port aux Basques, and that's where the ferry comes from Quebec. And so it's a busy little harbor town, and it's lovely, and there's lots of boardwalk parks to walk and whatnot. And this is a lighthouse in a town called Rose Blanche. Rose Blanche is basically the end of the road on the highway, and I stayed. And then if you want to go past Rose Blanche and head east, you have to take a boat or a plane. I stayed there for 3 days.
Terry, we're still seeing the B&B, Airbnb.
Oh, that's the lighthouse.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah, that's the Rose Blanche Lighthouse.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Hmm.
This was one of the things they do there is most of the boardwalk trails are named for somebody who spearheaded putting in the boardwalk trail. So like there's Christopher's Trail and there's, whatever. So this was a trail that was quite long. I didn't take the whole thing because it was terribly windy. But it was really beautiful. And I love all the boardwalks. Let's see. Okay, so this was in I think Burnt Islands, which is very near Rose Blanche, and that was one of my favorite little towns. You can see the damage from Hurricane Fiona. Hurricane Fiona was in 2022. It really hit the fishing stages and the boardwalks and the boats really hard, and they really haven't gotten much help from the government to repair things. Let's see. And this is another boardwalk. This went to some waterfalls. I took this trail. It was only about a mile, and you never see anybody else out there. I think in part because of so early in the year it was. Let's see. So this is just another boat. This was also in Burnt Islands. There were a lot of old fishing boats here at this wharf, and all the old fishing boats have like large processing areas, stainless steel cabinets and sinks and whatnot to process all the cod. When I was parked and getting out to go look at some of the boats, an old gentleman pulled up next to me in his car, and he said, "Are you from the government?" And I said, "No, I'm just a tourist taking photos." And he said, "You're not from the government, you're taking photos." I'm like, "Yeah, I'm just a tourist. I think it's beautiful here." And he said to me, "Was." I'm like, "Was?" And he said, "Was beautiful here." And he said, it's not anymore. And then he had a tear in his eye, and I just about lost it. After he left, I had to really process, what they're going through in these little communities, because I started then looking at the population of these communities and the history. It's like most of the communities, if there are 300 people this year, 10 years ago, there were 600 people. And so you just can see that, the writing on the wall. And a lot of the tourist towns have, their businesses are only open from June to September. And then the rest of the year, they collect basically what's just like unemployment would be here. And they do that because otherwise the tourists wouldn't have anywhere to go or anything to do when they came to Newfoundland and Labrador in the summer. But it also means the locals don't have access. They don't have the coffee shops, and they don't have the restaurants, and they don't have the little stores, because everything is so seasonal. And then they also don't have the fishing, and because the population has dwindled, they don't have the schools anymore. And sometimes, the towns don't have much in the way of groceries or gas. So it was really interesting. In this town in Burnt Isles, they had one store that had gas, groceries, post office, cards, hardware, paint, and liquor, all in one store. And liquor stores over there are separate, freestanding, kind of like here in Oregon. And same with post office, but they had everything all in one there. And this just gives you a sense of the town. They're all so small and charming, and you just kind of, have to wonder how they're going to continue to function. I loved seeing all the fishing gear. This was just hanging on the rail of a boat, all the old hooks and the buoys and whatnot. And here you can see they're set up to process all the cod. Sorry if it's grainy. So this was an interesting spot. This was also on Burnt Islands. This dock here behind the little fishing stage was pretty. You couldn't go out there. It's very unsafe. And that was from Hurricane Fiona. There was a guy who was down working on collecting kelp, and I was talking to him. I'm like, well, first, can I take your photo? And then I was asking him, like, what are you doing with the kelp? And they use it as fertilizer. And he's like, it's nature's gold. Your vegetables will never taste better than they will if you use kelp as a fertilizer. And you can see back up above the plastic. So this is their garden. They spent years bringing in and creating their own soil to grow their vegetables. And the hurricane, decimated the garden. They were able to capture, collect a lot of the soil that was along the bay and bring it back and start creating a new garden. But it's a process. A lot of the gardens there, because there's really no ground to grow things down into, they grow a lot of potatoes. But they were growing tomatoes and other vegetables above ground. Anyway, it was him and his brother. They were really interesting and very nice to talk to. But that's the dock that basically was all destroyed from the hurricane. Okay, so then after I left Rose Blanche, I headed up north along the west coast. It took me 2 days. Everything's you could drive from one end of the island to another in about 8 or 10 hours, but that's if you don't stop. And there's so many places to stop. So it takes a long time, and I didn't want to rush. So anyway, this is in an area called Arches Provincial Park. And I stopped there on my way up north, where I was then catching a ferry to go over to Labrador for 3 days. My B&B hosts, Gloria and Billy, were very nice. He was the cook in the morning, and she took care of the business. She was a school teacher, and he grew up in, again, another small island just across the bay from Forster's Point, where the B&B is. And his father had been a fisherman, and they had to move onto the mainland when the fishing ended. And then they became, they made a living by going out to the boats that were catching fish and taking the fish for processing in Port au Choix and selling it to wholesalers and distributors. So they were a bit of the middleman. And she was a school teacher. Let's see, where am I? Have I caught up with my, oh, this is Arches too. I think this is at Port au Choix, the lighthouse there. And you can just see, I mean, it's just rock everywhere. This is at Forster's Point. This is very close to where the bed and breakfast is. And I was happy to see an iceberg on the west coast of Newfoundland, because so far I'd only seen ice on the east coast. So that was fun.
Whoa.
Okay, so then I catch the ferry over to Labrador. When you, unbeknownst to me, the ferry hadn't run the week prior for a whole week because of ice, because the Strait of, I have to remember the name of the strait, but the strait that you go over or go through was completely iced. So then when we get to St. Barb, where the ferry station is, it was all iced. And it took the captain about a half hour using his thrusters off and on, off and on, off and on, to move all of the ice out of the harbor so that he could dock. And that was a fascinating thing to watch, and talking to the locals that knew exactly what he was doing and how he was doing it, and everything was interesting as well. Strait of Belle Isle. And I was talking to a couple brothers that I was sitting by on the ferry, and one of the brothers had been camping in Labrador, and he had to leave his RV there because the ferry was closed for a week and he had to work. So he had to drive the Quebec, Newfoundland, Labrador highway, and then take the ferry. And now he was going back to get his RV. He lives out, him and his brother both live out of town near Deer Lake, which is where the airport was that my brother flew out of. And he showed me a photo of like where he lived and, you know, kind of how remote it is and stuff. But he showed me a photo of a white fox that was on his back deck like a month earlier. And it was the first time he had ever seen a white fox, and he captured a photo of it. And it was just beautiful. And that was fun. Okay, so let's see, where am I? Okay, so let's go to the next one. Okay, when you land, you're actually landing, that ferry wharf is in Quebec. So, and it's a different time zone than Newfoundland and Labrador. Labrador is like, 5 minutes drive away from the ferry landing, but it sort of messes with your brain. And it's also very French since it's in Quebec. And this was just I was driving around because I wanted to just see this little town for a little bit before I headed over to Red Bay, which is where I was going to stay for 3 days. And I looked up and I saw this statue of Virgin Mary high up on a hill. And so, of course, let's go check that out. So I climbed up, or hiked up to the statue, but below you can see the Stations of the Cross and around the boat, and some little boardwalk paths and stuff. But it was a nice little leg stretcher. There's your French for you. Then I found this fabulous little coffee shop. I'm all about coffee and bakeries, just as FYI. So anyway, I found this fabulous coffee shop that had great espresso. So I had to buy 2 of them. So I had them for the next day at the Airbnb. And so anyway, they had the cutest little sign. The inside was really sweet, and the people that worked there were super nice. So that was kind of fun. So this was on my way to my Airbnb. I took a little road where I saw this photo op and stopped, and there was so much ice along the coast of Labrador. This is an area called the Pinware River, which apparently is a super popular salmon fishing river. So they do all kinds of vacations and stuff for people come there to catch salmon. It's beautiful. There are cemeteries everywhere, and the cemeteries have the best views. So they did right by the they did right by both folks when they buried them. And that cemetery, by the way, that you just saw was in Red Bay, and same with this old I'm not sure what this was. This on here is more like a fishing stage because it's right on the sea, but I'm not sure about this one. So Red Bay, little history about Red Bay. There's evidence that people have lived there for at least 8,000 years. It's also a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The Europeans came there to fish cod, salmon, seals, and whales. The Basque mariners came in the 16th century. It's an archaeological site that provides the earliest and most complete and best preserved testimony of the European whaling tradition. They would render had rendering ovens and for making whale oil. And then the big ships that would come in would take the oil back to Europe to use for lighting. They did that for about 70 years, and then the whale population was depleted. There's a lot of red terracotta pebbles on the beaches there, and that's all from roofing tiles that the Basque brought with them on the ships for roofs for the housing that they built. Tracy Hill, which I'll show you a picture of in a minute, was a lookout area for whales by American whalers in the late 18th century and early 19th century. And also then during World War II, local residents were recruited to report aircraft sighted from Tracy Hill. And it was also a base for anti-submarine units because it had excellent natural harbor that was safe, and so the unit patrolled the Strait of Belle Isle looking for enemy submarines. And it was also a major shipping lane for German submarines en route to Europe. Okay, so in the early 1900s, a landline was constructed from Quebec along the Labrador coast for early wireless telegraph systems. And there's a boardwalk that goes up an area called Tracy Hill, and it retraces the path of the landline. And it was used for incoming and outgoing messages and was the main method of communication in Red Bay until telephones were introduced in the 1960s. I thought this was kind of a fun photo because there's the use with care sign, and there's one area of the boardwalk that had not yet been repaired, but was early in the season. All the way up this hill, there were, it was mainly boardwalked and steps, but there were lots of little sayings that I thought were kind of fun and kept it interesting. There were 689 steps and a 500-foot elevation, mainly all boardwalks. I saw two people the whole time I was there, and one couple was coming down and the guy said to me, "You're almost there." And I thought, oh, good. But he lied. I was probably only about halfway there.
But you don't know how far they were going.
Right. I'm glad he didn't tell me. It looks beautiful, and it was beautiful. It was 40 degrees that day. And the day before there were 40 mile-an-hour winds. So I was gonna go up Tracy Hill the day before, and I got over there And I got out of my car and I'm like, there is no way, there's no shelter, because there's no trees, because nothing can grow. And so I went back to the Airbnb and came back the next day and had just perfect weather. So this is, there was a pond there. There's a old wives' tale that there was at one time a monster in this pond, but I didn't see any. But it's good for the kids. And I'm getting close to the top, but it was still cold and windy. But I had my nice wool hat, so I was fine. I took lots of layers with me, lots of wool. And this is a garden that they clearly had worked really hard at. And we're probably getting close to getting ready to plant. And you can see the little burgy bits in the background out in the bay. And just more, this was I just walked down the street from my Airbnb and saw this. And like I say, they need a graveyard for these old boats, but then they wouldn't be out here, for you to take photos of. So my Airbnb host I got to meet, and she had lived in Red Bay for a long time. And she was a waitress, and then she got a job, which a lot of people do. She got a job with a company up in Labrador City, and so eat for 2 weeks at a time. She's up there, and then 2 weeks at a time she's home, and they fly her there. She's a chef there, and then they fly her back home. And a lot of several people that I talked to had those kind of jobs where they worked oil rigs, or they worked offshore and were flown to and from. And some were gone for like 6 weeks at a time, some 2. But anyway, her name is Tracy, and she was telling me that she, when you need health care, you have to take the ferry back to Newfoundland and then go to St. Anthony's. And so to get to the ferry, it was an hour drive to the ferry, or maybe an hour and 15 minutes. You have to be there an hour early, or they cancel your ticket. And so, and then you take the ferry, which might be 2 hours, might be 2.5 hours. And then you have to drive another couple hours to St. Anthony for a doctor appointment. So very hardy. And they're used to it. They're thinking of moving over to Newfoundland because their daughter's going to college in Clarenville. But it was, I'm like, oh my gosh, you just kind of tough things out too. This was a morning. So I woke up in the morning, and the ferry was leaving at 7. I can't remember. So you have to be there an hour early, or they give your place away. And you also can't buy your ticket ahead of time. You can make your reservation ahead of time, but you have to go into the office to get your ticket. So of course I'm like, backing out how long it's going to take me to get there, and an hour, and then 15 minutes to buy my ticket, and blah, 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 blah. So I get up at like 5 a.m, and I look outside, and it was totally socked in. The fog, I couldn't really even see across the street. So then fortunately I had packed my car the night before. And of course I'm thinking, okay, now it's going to take me 2 hours to get to the ferry, because you can't drive very fast when you can't see in front of you. And it's also sunrise time when the moose are out. So I was scared to death I was going to hit a moose. So after about a half hour driving, the fog cleared, and then I'm driving along the coast. And then I had to stop and take some photos, because I just thought it was so beautiful to see the sun coming up and shining on the ice in the water. And this was the ferry ride back to Newfoundland. And it was a little bit slow, because you can't go fast through this, because you have to figure out how deep the icebergs are. Okay, these are called thrombolites. Is that what they're called? Now I have to get to my notes. Yeah, thrombolites. This is an area called Flowers Cove. They were the only known form of life from 3.5 billion to 630 million years ago. They're very, very rare. You can also see them in Australia. But they're bun-shaped unicellular creatures. And there's a walking trail that takes you to them. I don't even know why they let people over there, but they do. They must have a lot more where they don't let people walk around them. But anyway, that was a nice little detour. And more fishing stuff. More boats and ice. Yeah, so I did a iceberg boat trip out of St. Anthony's. It was so dang cold. But it was beautiful. It wasn't a sunny day, but still, it's just really interesting to see the different shapes of the ice. There's a site called Lansox Meadows, which is another UNESCO World Heritage Site that has Norse settlements and a lot of Norse history there. And they believe it's roughly 6,000 years old, where it was occupied by indigenous groups that long ago. And then this is what iceberg ice looks like. You can see all the little dots. And then when it gets wet, then it makes the snap, crackle, pop sound. Like Rice Krispie treats or Rice Krispies. I finally saw a moose. This was a male moose. He wasn't nearly as cute as the female moose, but she darted in, so I couldn't get a photo. This is what's called a jig's dinner, which is a traditional Newfoundland dinner. So it's salt meat, bread pudding, which isn't a pudding at all, but anyway, it's more like stuffing. I'm like, oh, I get bread pudding. Oh, not the kind you're used to. Potatoes, cabbage, carrots, turnips, and peas pudding, which is split peas that they cook and turn into a bit of a pudding. And so that was my jig's dinner. And that was delicious. It was a lot of food. I sat next to an elderly man who was just the sweetest guy. And he had such a strong accent, and I have my accent. But between the two of us, we managed to have a nice visit. This is a roadside garden, which is pretty popular there along the side of the highway. There'll be gardens where people will bring in dirt, and it's just a way for them to socialize, see other people, and be able to grow some potatoes, because they might not be able to grow anything on their land where their house is. And I do like sea glass, so this is some of my sea glass collection. Also along the side of the road, you'll see a lot of wood being cured, and a lot of them have a tag with like a number on it, and that's who owns the wood. And you'll see this all along the highway. This is the Tablelands, which is in Gros Morne, which is another UNESCO World Heritage Site, which is absolutely beautiful. The geology there is super interesting, which I won't go into, but it's worth reading about if you are interested in geology, and just how old all of this is. And I finally saw caribou, which was really fun. I'd heard a lot about the caribou. Oops. Oh, sorry. Dang. Let's see if I can go back one just so you can see. So that's the Tablelands. And you can hike up in there, which is a great visitor center for Gros Morne. This is a little area called Woody Point where I stayed a night. And this red colored building here is the Airbnb's daughter owns this, and it's a coffee shop, and it's the oldest wharf in Woody Point. And so this was a hike I did outside of a little town called Triton, and again, lots of boardwalks. There's a theme to my photos. Nice little covered bridge over the water. And more boats. And I loved this dandelion. Their dandelion flowers don't grow very tall. They're very compact and they're very short to the ground, probably because if they grew taller, they would, be knocked over by the wind. But I hadn't really seen a dandelion flower so wet before. Oh my gosh, what did I just do? Okay, this couple, just a quick story here. they, on Facebook, there was one person that I was communicating with that was giving me lots of ideas, and the Facebook page name was Junior, Betty, and then something else. So I just assumed I was communicating with Betty, and we arranged to meet for coffee. Then I found out that I was communicating all the time with Junior. And Junior, the man, was a truck driver. And so he knew the island inside and out.
Oh, yeah.
And it was really fun. And I had also learned, by then that Newfoundlanders like to talk. And so we had a 2-hour coffee at a Tim Hortons. But it was so much fun. And now I have a place to stay when I go back. They're super nice people.
Yeah.
That's just another little bit of perspective of how big the icebergs are. And this is, okay, I went to an old-fashioned shed party in Twillingate. This is called an ugly stick, which is a musical instrument. And then everybody got a hat to wear. And then we'll play you this. You can hear the stick. Anyway, it was fun. It was a fun night. So this is an area called Greenspond, which is a little ways from Twillingate and getting close to the very end of my trip. And it's got a lot of, oh, that's Twillingate again. I guess that was Twillingate. Sorry about that. Oh, another cemetery. I like to take pictures of cemeteries to give some perspective. And then you can see this house basically built on the rock. There's just so much rock there. And another cemetery. Okay. Let me tell you a little bit about Greenspond. So it was settled in the 1600s. Well, aside from the indigenous people who lived there first. And the house that I stayed in was a part of the Greenspond Historical Society. It was over a century old, and the woman who owned it, it had been in her family for a long time, and she had fixed it up into a really cute little Airbnb. And you could hike up this hill and get a really nice view of the town. But you think you're going to these towns and they're going to be like town, and you get there and it's like, oh, there's just a couple hundred people and there's no grocery store. So you have to plan ahead, which I learned. And 3 of the places I stayed in didn't have potable water, so you had to bring water. So I did have to hit a Walmart when I first got there and got an ice chest and case of water and some other things. And of course, lots of car snacks. So this is up on Greenspond too. They actually had a boardwalk and a pathway that went around the island, which was really nice. And this was a trail that I took that was a little treacherous, but they did have the boardwalk in the right places to get you over the rocks. And this is an area called Savage. I'm watching the clock now, so I'm going to zip through some of this. On the Eastport Peninsula, and it's been host to human settlements for at least 5,000 years with a variety of indigenous culture groups dating back to 7,000 BC through 3,500 BC, and then other groups that settled there. And the gravestones from some of the burial sites were back into the mid 1800s. And this was a harbor. I love boats. This was, I think this was on the Burren Peninsula. And the only reason why I went down the Burren Peninsula was because photos that were being posted on Facebook by a guy. And it turned out his brother had an Airbnb that I rented, and this is another fishing stage.
I was gonna say, I hope that's not the Airbnb.
Nope. More boats. So the Airbnb, this is the Airbnb. The Airbnb was called Pearl's Place. I measured it out. They had a tape measure there. It's 36 feet by 36 feet. And Gus is the guy who owns it. And his mom was Pearl. And Pearl passed away a few years ago. And Pearl had 12 children. And they all lived in this home with Pearl and Dad. And one side of the home had 3 bedrooms that couldn't have been more than, what? I don't know, 10, 20, 30. Yeah. And so 3 bedrooms for 12 kids and then mom and dad. And then the other side of the house was, just living area and a little kitchen. And it was really interesting talking with him. He also had a beautiful harbor that went with the Airbnb. These flags are all the provinces, and he also has a flag for Ukraine. So, he got a gold star in my book.
Yeah.
I was tempted to take the rowboat out one day, but it was so windy. If it were a kayak, I would have gone out, but I don't know about my rowboat skills. And of course, I had to take a picture of the dildo sign. Jimmy Kimmel is the honorary mayor of Dildo, but it's also another charming little town with marinas and fishing stages that they've painted and whatnot. It's really beautiful. And a little farm that I passed. So I had to say hi to the sheep and the goats. This is part of a telegraph museum that happened to be open. They had all of the old equipment there, which was really interesting. It was also interesting listening to them talk about the impact the telegraph system had on the little communities, because they brought in, Europeans to do the work, and they created communities for those immigrants, and they created schools for them. And so there was like the haves and then the locals that, still were fishermen and had their, little schools and stuff. And there wasn't much in the way of cross socialization. And so there were some hard feelings about that. So the original telegraph machines could transcribe 8 words a minute. Not very much. And I think this is the last picture. I was out on a little bluff area, and there was a bench and there was a photographer there. And I'm like, will you take my picture? So 3 icebergs. And if I zoom in, you can see the little boat.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, so it gives you some perspective. And he's keeping a nice safe distance from the berg. And this is one of those long tabular.
Oh, I was going to ask.
In the back. Yeah.
Oh.
That it was really long. So I think that's it.
Oh, what a trip.
There were a lot of or several towns there that were originally military bases, American military bases during the war. And they had brought a lot of resources to those towns and built schools and whatnot. And those towns have a bit of a different feel to them than the small coastal community towns. But I'll leave you with one word: couldn'ts. Couldn'ts is your new word for leftovers, and it means that what you eat today is what you couldn't eat yesterday. Couldn'ts. I'm sorry I zoomed through. Did anybody have questions?
Terry, was wonderful.
Oh, thank you.
Gotta leave.
Fantastic. Thank
You
you.
did so well traveling on your own. That was interesting.
Yeah, I love it. Yeah, I do. I interact more with local people when I'm traveling by myself than when I'm traveling with somebody else.
Right. Yeah.
And I have to sometimes talk myself into going out and doing things, like going to that shed party. It was a nasty night. I could have easily just stayed in my B&B. But I'm glad I went. So, yeah. Lots of fun.
Wow. Thank you.
Thanks,
This was-
Terry.
Yes, great, great.
Would you go at the same time of year? Is that the right time of year to go?
It's the right time of year if you don't want to get eaten alive by all the black flies
Oh.
They come out towards the like end of June or early July, but then that's
Mhm.
when all the whales are. So I don't know. I would probably go back like mid-June to mid-July. But and just you have to take netting and stuff and long sleeves and whatnot to protect yourself from the flies. But people are posting pictures of them being all bitten up by these flies. It's like, oh yeah, I'm glad I didn't have to experience that.
Yeah.
Is there a relationship between whales and the flies?
I don't think so. Yeah.
So Terry, did you take this with your phone or did you use a camera?
All with my phone.
I mean,
Oh.
you're a very good photographer. You have a wonderful eye.
Thanks.
I
like it. It's a lot of fun for me.
Yeah. And is that an iPhone?
Yep. And it's not the best one either. It's only has 2 lenses. My little brother, I almost like had him switch phones with me. He has the 14 Pro or something, and it took amazing photos. So I think I might have to get a new phone. I'm going to Antarctica in November, and I think I might have to get a new phone.
Yeah.
I'll do another one of these after that trip.
Fantastic.
They call you the Ice Maiden.
Yeah.
Who
Yeah.
are you going to Antarctica with?
My older brother this time. His wife doesn't want to go, so I said, I'll go.
Are you doing a National Geographic cruise or something?
No, we're doing a different one, but it's the same sort of thing
Oh,
with kayaking and snowshoeing and all of that.
unbelievable.
All right. Yeah.
Wow. Well, you're inspiring, Terry. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks.
And I didn't have to buy my car. There were a few times I thought for sure I was going to have to buy my rental car. But I didn't have to.
Very good.
But you're so right about traveling on your own, which is what I do as well, because you do want to talk to people,
Yeah.
and that's the way it happens.
Yes. And you don't have the schedule that you might have if you're with somebody else that wants to.
Yeah.
But
Mm.
look at being able to talk to the people and you really know what they're like.
Mhm.
Yes. Yes.
And they're
Yep. Yeah.
great.
That's great. And the other thing in these little towns is a lot of the Airbnb hosts, like they're there,
Yeah.
so you get to, visit with them a little bit too, which is
Mhm.
nice. Makes it more personal.
Mhm.
Okie dokie.
All right.
Well,
This was a
thank
great way
you.
to spend the morning.
Thanks again.
Thank
All
you.
right. All right.
If you have any
Very-
questions, just holler.